My name is Louise and I work in the Community Library Service in Dublin City Libraries. And I'm delighted to hand you over to today's speaker, Cathy Scuffil.
Thank you very much, Louise, for that lovely introduction, and congratulations on the new community library in Dremne. Wish you every success with it. Just before I put up the slides this morning, I just want to say a big thank you to both Kate and to Louise for their arrangements for today. These events don't just happen, they have to be caused to happen, and I'm just delighted that so many of you could actually join us for the talk today. So if you bear with me for a moment, I'll put up my slides and we will take it from there, okay? Now, I hope everybody can see that all right. So, the history of Drimnagh, or Drimnagh a history. Where to begin? What a fascinating suburb we have in Drimnagh. And it just encompasses so much part of our Irish history when we start breaking it down. So just a couple of little points about Dremne. I'm going to put up a slightly blurry map just so you get a general idea of what we're talking about. For anybody who's not from the Dremne area, this is a great way of getting to know it. So Dremne, city suburb, has 4 stations on the Lewis, Sure Road, it has Golden Bridge, it has Drimnagh, and it has Black Horse. So they're the 4 stations on the Lewis. So the Lewis is one of its newest boundaries, but before that, the Grand Canal would have been acknowledged as the boundary for Drimnagh on that side of the city. On the other side, it's also bounded by the Grand Canal, the circular line. So the piece that goes up by Herberton Road, so that would be slightly off to the right of our screen around there. So that's the other natural boundary for Drimnagh itself. The main boundary, and the one everyone would know about, is the Crumbling Road, the road that stretches all the way out into the suburbs. So the Crumbling Road nicely encompasses the Drimnagh we know today. So Crumbling Road on one side and the Grand Canal on the other. That's one of the oldest stretches of the canal, one of the widest, and it's also one of the straightest. So it's sort of a lovely natural boundary for the Drimnagh area. Heading further west, well, where does it end and where does it begin? And this is where the story today will actually pick up. The whole area that we're familiar with, the houses, the park, the church, all around there, developed sometime between the late 1930s and the mid 1940s. And we'll see later on how the land came about for a lot of the development of this area. And you'll pick up on 1 or 2 of the place names that you will be familiar with and the reasons behind them. So, if we go back to the old name, Drimnagh, the name Drimnagh itself gives us so much that it can tell us about the area. So imagine we're standing on the Crumbling Road and we look way off into the distance, and what we can see are the Dublin Mountains. So as the Dublin Mountains comes nearer the city of Dublin, it tapers into the Green Hills. So Green Hills is a suburb of Dublin, and we're well familiar with it. And the name it does exactly what it says. It was the Green Hills at the end of the Dublin Mountains themselves. But this is where the name Drimnagh comes into its own. It's an old Gaelic word meaning Drimnagh, sandy ridge, or the place of the ridges. So it's like the end of the mountains where it tapered out into sandy ridges itself. So it's actually describing the landscape. So from the Dublin Mountains to the Green Hills to the sandy ridges. So the sandy ridges is Drimnagh. So delighted when the Lewis put the sign up, Drimnagh, and there it was, Drimnagh, in Irish meaning sandy ridge. The other place names that we have nearby, of course, are Bluebell. Bluebell's sort of it's the Inchicore area, you know, it's that divide, but it would be another townland beyond Drimnagh itself, but technically in Drimnagh, and again, we'll see that. Walkinstown is significant to our story, and there's a couple of pieces about Walkinstown that'll pop up today. The village in the distance, if we can imagine this area as countryside, like my image there on screen, the next village up would have been Crumlin. And of course, Crumlin comes from the Crooked Glen, Crumglina, that's what it means. And believe it or not, Crumlin's Crooked Glen is in Dremne. It's that glen there, it's the Lansdowne Valley, where the Cammack River makes its way through. So the crooked glen that gives Crumbling its name actually is in Drimnagh itself. So we've all these crossovers and various place names that are connected with our area. On the other side, of course, we have Rialto, and Rialto and Dolphins Barn are sort of interchangeable in many respects. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the water that's around and part of the whole Dremne story are the Grand Canal itself at Herberton Road, on the Crumbling Road, and then of course, Lansdowne Valley, which is the Cammack River. So these are all part of the Drimnagh landscape. But Drimnagh itself moves. So what was known as Drimnagh in the past isn't the Drimnagh we know today. So we're going to unpick the story, work it out together and see what we can actually come up with. So I like to say that Drimnagh moves. It's a movable feast itself. I have a lovely old image here that I found in the City Library and Archive, and this is our pre-Lewis Drimnagh. So this is when the canal was definitely the border between Drimnagh and Inchicore. And you can see there where the people are walking is actually where the Lewis tracks are today. One of these images that most of us would remember, but in the next 20, 30 years, this image will be gone. And it's just a lovely one to know that we have it safe in the City Library and Archive. And I love to include anything that I can find in the archive itself when I'm doing various talks. If only the traffic on the Davit Road was down to one car at any time, wouldn't it be great? But as you can see in this picture, taken some time in the 1970s, there's one car making its way down Davit Road. I want to tell you that Drimnagh is indirectly mentioned in Ulysses, and I found it in Ithaca. I've gone through Ulysses to see if I can find local mentions, because I know for a fact that Joyce used an awful lot of local references when he was writing. For example, he meets Molly Bloom. Molly Bloom is met for the first time on the South Circular Road near Dolphins Barn. So little things like that. What's key here is he's talking about a preambulation, which I can't say, a walk in the general area of the South Circular Road. You can see mentions there of Longwood Avenue, Leonard's Corner, Sing Street and Bloomfield Avenue. However, there's two other places mentioned. Gibraltar Villa is mentioned and Bloomfield House in Crumlin. Now, Gibraltar Villa, for those of you who know Drimnagh, and you know where Security Corps is at the Herberton Bridge, that's Gibraltar Villa, and that's mentioned in Joyce. So our first literary reference for the day, and probably our only one, but here we have the area that we're speaking about mentioned in Ulysses. Kind of nice. There, he's Percy Upjohn in Ulysses is reclining against a wall near Gibraltar Villa. So just to set the scene, and it's there, it's mentioned in Ulysses itself. But to get back to our moving Drimnagh, so here's an image that took a bit of doing to find it, but this is the original Drimnagh. This is a tumulus that was located in the area. I'll explain where in a few moments. And it initially was a huge big mound constructed by our forefathers. It's the Neolithic part of Drimnagh itself. This tumulus was mainly made up of that sandy material, you know, gravel, sand, but a couple of items found in it are on display in our National Museum, in particular a funereal bowl that was located within the tumulus itself when it was properly excavated. You can see by this image that temporary supports have been put in on the tumulus as it's been quarried away in places. So the gravel, the sand, the material that was used in the burial mound itself was slowly but surely quarried away over the years by the local people. But you can see it's set in a very, very rural landscape. Now, where could this be? Well, if anybody knows the Walkinstown Avenue and the park in Walkinstown Avenue and the way the park rises slightly, it's sort of like a hill, and local people who grew up in that area would probably remember it as a sandy quarry or a sandy area, an area that they would go in and play before it was laid out as a park. This actually is the exact site of the Dremne tumulus, and that's why you say the story of Walkinstown is intermingled with the story of Dremne, and this is the first reference we have to Dremne. The Dremne tumulus was located up in the Walkinstown Avenue that we know today, but that would have been the ancient lands of Dremne itself. Very impressive burial mound, quite a big landmark in our landscape itself. And just to set a map then, to show you the next bit of the moving Dremne, well, the next bit we have is that if we come down the Long Mile Road, which, as you know, junctions with the Walkinstown Avenue. And this is where we have the other Dremne, the next part of our story. And of course, that's none other than Dremne Castle itself. And I have the castle marked on the map here. This would have been the Long Mile Road here. And you can see too then other place names picking up Dremne Cottage. And the other thing that the area was associated with were mills, because the Cammock River provided a source of power. So there would have been Dremne paper mills located behind the castle. Anybody familiar with the Lansdowne cottages behind the castle? You know that shop, it used to be, was it the Coconut on the Long Mile Road? There's a roadway down beside of it, and that leads you down to the old cottages that were associated with the Dremne paper mill. So that's it there. And you can see that the river is heavily re-engineered in order to provide a mill race to turn the mill wheel of the mills itself. So this is something that you find a feature in and around Dublin. We no longer use this water power, but it was a very, very important feature in the past. So it's all very fine to see a castle like that. Let's run through a couple of little facts about Dremne Castle before we actually look at an image of the castle as it would have looked long before the schools were built around it. Okay, so it's an Irish castle, quite obviously. It has the only complete moat of an Irish castle. So that's one huge claim to fame about Dremne Castle. And its moat is flooded by a tributary of the Cammock River itself called the Blue Bell River. So again, the moat around the castle is hugely important. The only Irish castle that has its complete moat. Even Dublin Castle hasn't got its complete moat. For about 600 years, this is the home of the Barnwall family. Barnwalls are associates of Strongbow. Strongbow was dividing up all the lands around Dublin as part of the Norman invasion as such, and the Barnwall family were the family who benefited from getting the lands in and around this area. In the 1900s, it was actually owned by a city councillor, Joseph Hatch, who was from Leeson Street, and he used the lands around Dremne Castle for grazing. And it was also the Hatch family summer home. So they would come out from the city. He lived in Leeson Street, but they would move out from the city out to Dremne for the summertime. As we know later on, then it became the Christian Brothers Schools, that fine big complex of schools that we have on the Long Mile Road itself, known as Dremne Castle, because obviously the castle is right in the middle of the grounds. And the castle itself has undergone quite a bit of restoration. And as a result of being a castle with a flooded moat set in a lovely location, it's been used as a film set. So it's our local film set area, and something that is sort of part of the whole Dremne story, a very important part of the Dremne story. Now, I have a couple of old images of it here. The one on the left actually is a brilliant photograph of the moat around the castle. And you can see the steps there leading into the castle itself. So the moat was a form of defence. And why did we need defence? Well, we have the Burns and the O'Tooles who are none too happy about being having their lands taken away from them. They're living up in the Dublin mountains at this stage after Strombo. So you need to secure your castles. Dremne being one, the other one in Ballyfermot, there would have been Dumbro on the north side. So these were all fortifications on the outskirts of Dublin City. And this, of course, is a very haunting old image of Dremne Castle itself. Actually love that one. Because when you look at the building even today, it still looks very atmospheric. It's, excuse me, it's very much part of an unusual bygone era. Excuse me. A couple of other images that I have on it. This is from the restoration of the castle in 1986. So we can thank all of the restorations that were done during the 1980s for having the castle there today. And you can see there was extensive work done on it to bring it back to a roof on it, bringing it back from something that could have fallen into ruin quite easily into something that could be used in a more formal way. And anybody who goes to Specsavers, if you look at this photograph a little closely, you might recognise this gentleman standing up in the roof of Dremne Castle as it's been restored, and that is Bertie Hearn. So it's a photograph, again, I found in the archive, Bertie Hearn on the roof of Dremne Castle as the restoration work is taking place. So it was extensive work that was done in the 1980s. You can see there quite a lot of restoration to be done. And this is the day that Bertie Hearn came out to visit to view the restoration work for himself. Now, no self-respecting castle would be complete without a love story and without a ghost. Now, a lot of the locals will tell the story a lot better than I can. But let's say it's all to do with this. Now, this is the public house on the Dremne Road called the Eleonora. I always say to people, when you see things like this, ask a little bit more about why we have a pub called Eleonora's on the Dremne Road. And it's all to do with the Lady Eleanora de Barnwell, who was from Dremne Castle. Her claim to fame isn't that she has a pub called after her on the Dremne Road, but it's that she has this claim that she was a maid, a bride, and a widow in one day. She is actually contracted in marriage to her cousin, Edmund de Barnwell, or it goes, they use Barnwell, and de Barnwell, but they're all the same names. So she's actually engaged to be married to her cousin Edmund. And we have this fantastic procession out from Dublin, from Dremne Castle into the city of Dublin to Patrick's Cathedral, where the bells are ringing to greet them for the big, big wedding day. They get married. They're on their way back to Dremne Castle for the big party that's going to take place after the wedding. And somewhere along the route, possibly around Dolphins Barn, certainly in and around the Crumbling area, because that was the ancient route into town, the whole wedding party is attacked by the famous O'Byrnes from the Dublin mountains. Why? Well, Eleonora, although she was engaged to be married to her cousin, had taken a bit of a shine to Sean O'Byrne from the Dublin mountains, the rebel from the mountains. In the whole melee that follows, her husband is killed. Also, Sean is severely wounded. She makes her way, she's brought back to the castle where she has a lot of explaining to do, and so much so that she manages to make her escape from the castle. She's distraught. She's trying to find, where is Sean O'Byrne gone? Makes her way into the Dublin mountains, finds a freshly dug grave in the valley of Glenmesmole. Sean O'Byrne had died as a result of the big attack on the wedding party. Eleonora herself was found there 3 days later, dead on the grave of Sean O'Byrne. It's said Eleonora, to this very day, haunts Dremne Castle. And who am I to argue with that? But we also have a pub called after her. So a maid, a bride, and a widow in one day, Our Lady Eleonora. Now, just to revert back to my map, if you remember this from earlier, Dremne Castle located as we say, on the Long Mile Road. You remember this with Dremne Cottage and the mills in behind it. Now, I've made the map larger because every one of these castles, the Norman castles, would have had another item associated with them. And that other item would be the church and a graveyard. Now, Ballyfermot is a brilliant example of all of these on one site. So under the park known as the Lawns in Ballyfermot, you have the remains of Ballyfermot Castle, Ballyfermot Church and Ballyfermot Graveyard all side by side. In Dremne, it's a little bit different. Because of the complex we have behind the castle involving the river, Dremne Church is located in what we know today as Bluebell. So here we are again with our moving Dremne. What we know today as Bluebell actually contains the Dremne Church way off our map. So that's why I have two circles on the map, one to show the castle and the other to show the church and graveyard. Today we know it as Bluebell Cemetery, but the remains of the old church are located in around that area as well. So it's just really interesting to associate the two sites. Very hard to get from one to the other today because of our road system. You need to go up the Long Mile Road, turn right, head in the direction of Bluebell, turn right again down by the Royal Iver Park in order to find Bluebell Cemetery itself. But in bygone days, you would have just followed the river course over to the church. And I have the two images side by side. This is a contemporary image of Dremne Castle taken by my other half. This is how it looks today. And this is the original Dremne Parish Church and the original Dremne Graveyard. And beyond it then, of course, is Bluebell Cemetery, all part of the one complex. But important to link the two sites and to understand that Bluebell would have been part of Dremne as well, this famous moving Dremne that we have as part of our story. And of course, the grounds of Bluebell Cemetery were given in the early years of the 1900s, around 1905, I think, is the first burial there. And that's given by Lord Lansdowne. And Lord Lansdowne, of course, was the big landowner, one of the big landowners in the area. He gives the grounds by the side of the Cammock as a new burial ground for the people of County Dublin. New burial ground in 1905. So just to sort of link the whole lot up, the church rooms in Bluebell Cemetery are connected with our castle on the Long Mile Road. So just to sort of think in the broadest possible sense if you're thinking about Dremne. Now here's another gentleman that would have been important to our Dremne story, and it's none other than Alderman Michael Flanagan. Nature public representative from approximately 100 years ago. Alderman Michael Flanagan lives in Port Mahon House in Rialto, has a very, very large family, lives there with his wife Anne Collins, who is from Crumlin. They were married in the old Crumlin Parish Church, and they settled as they raised their family in Port Mahon in Rialto. Alderman Flanagan not only is your public representative, but he's also a considerable landowner in this whole area. At one time it was said he had the whole of Crumlin under cabbage. So this man is very, very important to the whole general area. And of course he owns quite a bit of land in and around the Dremne area. And one of the things that he actually owned was a house called Leicester House. Now, I happened to get a plan of it from the Humphreys family tree site, and this is the area of Leicester House, the area of land that Leicester House had on the Dremne Road, which later became the Long Mile Road. You can just about make out our Dremne cottage there. And you can see the halfway house. So they're little landmarks that we will be half familiar with. If we take the halfway house as being the public house, and then of course Dremne Cottage is behind the coconut shop on the Long Mile Road. And our castle is just slightly off the screen there. I think you just about make out Dremne Castle. But look at the lands that Leicester House actually had. More or less road frontage onto what we know today as the Dremne Road. There's Leicester House. What would it look? It's not very fine looking at a plan, but to try and get an image of what the house might have looked like, well, Believe it or not, this is it. This is it more or less in ruin, but the house itself was there up until about the 1980s, funnily enough. These images are taken sometime in the mid-1970s. This is Leicester House. And there's some of the outhouses that are associated with it as well. So just to put up an image of Leicester House, one of the big old houses that would have existed in around this area. The man I showed you earlier, Alderman Flanagan, he gives Leicester House to his son Larry as his home. So this is where Larry Flanagan lived, and Larry Flanagan is listed as a market gardener. So you can see he's like his father. He has probably this part of Dremne under cabbage as well. As I said, parts of it were still there into the 1980s, and the stables of the house are still there today. They're actually the line of houses just down from the Children's Research Centre on the Drimnagh Road that are set back from the road. They've all been converted into houses. They're the former stables of Leicester House. And of course, now I've nearly given it away. What has been built on the lands of Leicester House since? Well, none other than Our Lady's Children's Hospital. And here we have another one of our little Drimnagh problems. This is known as Our Lady's Hospital for Sick Children, Crumlin today. Crumlin, but it's in Drimnagh. So we have this mix-up of names again. And the reason is that at the time the hospital was being built in 1956, this part of Drimnagh was known as Crumlin North. So you find that mix-up of areas, but this is more or less built on the lands of Leicester House, which had been owned by Alderman Flanagan, who lived in Rialto and had given it to his son, Larry, to live in for his lifetime. Now, one thing about Drimnagh is that beautiful park we have right in the middle of it. Brickfield Park, or the Brickers, as most people know it, just a fantastic resource. I'm sure many of us availed of it. I know I did during the lockdown, for a place just to go for a nice brisk walk around it, very doable, nice size, and yet you do feel like you've been out. The lovely thing about it was most people were doing what I was doing and going around a second time, and you'd meet them a second time. So we kept our distance, but still managed to say hello. Great for the dog walkers of the area. Why is it called Brickfield Park? It's not called Drimnagh Park. It's called Brickfield Park. And this brings us to another part of our story. In the late 1890s, this advertisement appeared in the papers, announcing that the Dolphins Brick Company was being set up. And they were going to use the lands that we know today as Drimnagh, but it would have been known as Grove Field Farm. They were going to use that land because they had discovered the soil in the land was very, very suitable for brick making. And this is a time of huge development in Dublin. The late 1800s, huge housing estates are being built in areas like Rathgar, Rathmines, in and around the city itself. The Artisan Dwelling Company are building all along the Coombe. There's a lot of house building going on. And at the time, all the houses would have been built using bricks. This is what the Dolphins Barn brick looks like. You can get them today. This is one that I have used for a candle holder, which explains the stain in this right-hand corner when the candle grease actually got away from the holder itself. But the one significant thing about the bricks is this indent in them and the words Dolphins Barn without the apostrophe written in the middle of them, imprinted into the brick itself. And this clay for the brick making would have all been quarried or mined in and around the Drimnagh area at different times. So they would use one field this year, quarry out the brick clay, then cover it over and put it for grazing and move to another field. So you had this constant movement from one part of the area to the other. The Dolphins Brick Company was a huge company, a significant local employer. I found in 1901 census that an awful lot of the men living around the Dolphins Barn and Rialto area were actually employed by the Dolphins Brick Company. You didn't need a huge amount of skills to work there, but you needed reliable workforce. It was very labor intensive at the time, and it was well paid because there was a huge demand for the product. It was a thriving company. Now, to give you an idea of how it operated, I've shown you Brickfield Park. So that would have been a big part of the fields that they would use for taking out the clay for making the bricks. But the offices of the place are located elsewhere on the Crumbling Road. The Brick Company is famous for one thing that happened during the 1916 Rising. And here he is, James Connolly. James Connolly goes missing for a couple of days, about 3 days in the build-up to the Rising. For a long time, it wasn't really known where he had been brought to. And you got various accounts of him being brought to Lucan or brought out into County Dublin. But during the 1916 commemorations in 2016, more and more publications came out, and it has now been established that James Connolly was brought to the premises of the Dolphins Brick Company on the Crumbling Road and held there, which is probably the wrong word, but he was kept there for 3 days while discussions took place, talking him into including the Citizens' Army in the 1916 Rising. We know that Sean McDermott would have been there with him. It's quite possible too that Eamon Cant was there as well. The Brick Company was used for quite a lot of things during the Rising. It's used for training by Na Fianna in 1916. They talk about using it as an arms jump. They said that pikes made in the railway in Inchicore were hidden in the lands of the brickworks. Remember, they stretched all the way down to the Grand Canal, where we know Davit Road to be today. They mention here in one of the witness statements that they had a depot in the Obsolete Church in Inchicore. They also, another witness statement mentions that the houses up of Mrs. Flood's house in Bluebell. In fact, St. Patrick's Athletic would have played in Flood's fields at one time. And they mentioned too that they used them for storage of various items in preparation for the Rising at the brickworks at Dolphins Barn. So you find it mentioned randomly in the witness statements. I've been through them over and over again just to find all of those references, and they all start to build up into an area that was considered easy to hide items in preparation for the Rising. Why was it easy? Well, part of it was that the gentleman who was the foreman of the Dolphins Brick Company was a man called Peter Cassidy, and he was sympathetic to the actual cause. So he turned a blind eye and obviously facilitated a lot of the storage of items during the Rising in the area. This is a fantastic aerial photograph of the area taken in the 1940s. And believe it or not, I got this from a British website. So I often wonder, what were they doing flying over Dublin in the 1940s, taking pictures? But there again, here we go. Just to place this for you, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the image, there's Loretta Crumlin on the Crumbling Road. So my old alma mater, and there is the school. So we're looking here at Sundrive Road, we're looking at Old County Road, and we're looking at the Crumbling Road. And of course, then logically, we're looking to the right towards Dremne. Just here you can see the relatively newly built Sundrive Road Garda station, which of course isn't on Sundrive Road at all. It's actually on the Crumbling Road, but that's again another one of those little anomalies that we seem to get quite a lot of. And here you can see the beginnings of Dremne being built. So here are the houses all along Herberton, and you know those keyholes that we find at various points along the area. Now this is the extensive works of Morricrete, which later replaced the Dolphins Barn brickworks, but you can see that this is all the administrative area of the brick company. And if you look at the undulating ground off in the distance, this is where Brickfield Park is, and you can see how heavily worked all that land has been to take the clay out to make the Dolphins barn brick. So this is still being used or being quarried out. You can just about make it out there, still being quarried out for use by Maori and by the Dolphins barn brick company who are located here. This, of course, is the Ivy grounds, the sports grounds up the Crumbling Road. So just to sort of place it nicely for us, you can still see that by the 1940s, this was still a heavily industrialized area from the point of view of it being part of the brick company. To place it then, this is a great image that I found when the workers at the Dolphins barn brick company all went on strike. So I've often wondered what it looked like at the main gate on the Crumbling Road. There's no evidence of it there today. And of course, then when we find them go out and strike, we get a great photograph of actually the buildings as part of the brick company. I suspect some of them would have been the remains of the old Grovefield farm, which was located there. And there they all are, out on strike, on picket duty, walking up and down. You can see 2 women as well as men employed there. And there's our Garda Síochána, just keeping an eye on things to make sure that they just picket the building and nothing else happens. Again, you can see how remote it would have been, and there's the clay pits marked on the map. So Carnlough House is Loretta Crumlin. This is that big junction we're looking at. So we are now looking at it in a map as opposed to on the photograph, and there's the brickworks marked. And of course, there would have been temporary sheds in some cases. Again, I got this from the City Library and Archive. Sometimes the Dolphins barn brick company is actually called the Crumbling Brick Company. So they would have built temporary sheds. You can see in this case, they're actually in the process of knocking down the sheds. And again, these ones are built with cavity blocks, which were also constructed or made by the Maori company. They would have made these temporary sheds, pulled them down as they needed to move the works slightly around the site. The best example we have of Dolphins barn brick is this wonderful wall located at the top of Brickfield Drive in Dremne. And this wall is particularly special for a couple of reasons. One, of course, it commemorates the Dolphins barn brick company, and it's an entire wall that we have constructed of it, left there as a quiet memorial to all the people who worked in the brick company over the years. Many of our family members worked in this company. But why the wall is that little bit special are these bricks here. The curved ones that you see at the very top of the wall, and also the angled ones that we have here. And if you could see them in a little bit more detail, I might have a picture, actually, I think I do. John took one for me. This is looking at the wall upside down, and you see engraved in the brick isn't Dolphins barn, but DBC. This is the other name that the brick company went by, the Dublin Brick Company. They used different brands for different things. These particular bricks were called the Dublin Brick Company, all made on the site, made with exactly the same clay. These are a very rare type of brick. I collect these things. I only have one of these, so they're rare enough. And that's what makes that wall that little bit special. It's a memorial to our past, and it's sort of a lovely practical one because the wall itself encloses the cul-de-sac, and yet it's a wall relating to our past. So I particularly like this one because it's Dolphins barn brick and Dublin Brick Company brick all together, all the one company, but they use different brandings, different names, and it includes those very, very unusual cornered bricks. They're deliberately made that way just to give a feature on the wall itself. So particularly fond of that wall. If anything ever happens, would somebody give me a ring? Because I'd love to make sure that it stays there. It's part of our past, part of our heritage, part of Drimnagh's history, and an important part at that. The houses in Dremne, the last to be built using the Dolphins barn brick, are this lovely group in the middle of Morn Road. And this is where the Dolphins barn brick company story and the Dremne story come together. Believe it or not, most of the land that Dremne is built on was compulsory purchased from the Dolphins Brick Company. And effectively, the construction of Dremne put the brick company out of work. It stopped the production of the bricks. Now, a couple of other things were happening. Bricks were falling out of fashion as a means of building material. We were going into the concrete era as such. So they didn't need the extensive brick fields or clay pits that they had in the past in order to produce the concrete. So Morocrete could exist on a much smaller location. So when Dremne went ahead in the 1940s, this part of Dremne goes ahead in the 1940s, these are the last houses to be built using Dolphins brick, and they stand out on Morn Road. They're a feature on Morn Road, and there's a couple of them on Galtymore Road as well, built with these distinctive yellow brick, the yellow speckled brick. That's Dolphins Barn, clay taken from literally the site where these houses are built. That's a better picture of them. You can see what I mean about the speckling of the bricks. They weather so well, Dolphins brick, and fit so nicely into their landscape. And this is a good example of the middle of the terrace where you get that unusual eave being put in to the roof of the houses on Morn Road. The other houses that we have connected with the brick company are this group on the Crumbling Road called the Maori Cottages. So most people coming out of Brickfield Drive, heading down the Crumbling Road towards the former Crumbling Shopping Centre, would pass these houses, Maori Cottages. Two groups built, one in the 1930s, as you can see this lot were, and then the second lot were built in the 1950s, built by the Maori Company for their workers, so built on the Crumbling Road. And Maori is a mixture of two words, Moran concrete. So that's where we get Maori from. And the Maori cottages, as I say, were built for their workers. And they as well stand as a testament to the people who worked in Maori. And Maori provided the means to build our city that little bit further, paving slabs, lighting poles, and an awful lot of the big concrete piping that was used for our new sewage systems that were put in throughout the city itself. And of course, you can't have an area like the Dolphins Brickworks without having a mention of it even in the War of Independence. So I found this one again, another statement from the Bureau of Military History, and they talk here about actually intercepting military trucks as they were collecting material for building out in Baldonnel. So Baldonnel is under construction 100 years ago, and they hijack some of the military trucks near the Dolphins Brick Company and bring them up into the mountains where the military trucks are actually burnt. So it just shows you the whole area was always involved when our country was developing. From our revolutionary time onwards. This is rural County Dublin. The brickworks are a landmark. They're a sympathetic place. They're somewhere that you can intercept the military trucks quite easily. And this was all part of the guerrilla campaign during the War of Independence. And again, part of our national history. And yet it's a local story. And of course, the other local story, and this featured in the festival this year, the story of the Halfway House pub on the Dremne Road, actually at the junction of Walkinstown Road, Dremne Road, and the Long Mile Road. And it's a well-known landmark, and there's been a pub on this site for a considerable number of years. It would have been an old staging point, place to change the horses, place to rest up, an old inn on the road in and out of Dublin. And of course, it actually became involved in our revolution as well. And just to touch on it briefly, here's a newspaper cutting from just over 100 years ago. It actually happened this year, 100 years ago, in and around, I think it's May 1921. And the house was actually destroyed by the Black and Tans. I love this particular image, because you can see here the policeman, probably a DMP man sent out from the city, maybe an RIC man sent out to guard the site. But you can see this young man, he's making his way in and around the back of the pub in the image itself. Local story has it that the locals came down and they took the tiles from the floor of the pub to keep them as souvenirs, but also to pave the pathways towards their cottages in County Dublin, some of which can still be seen on the Ballymount Road, just a little bit further up from the pub. Another image that I got from Fionnuala Watchhour's fantastic book, Crumbling and the Way It Was. Again, you can see the destruction of the halfway house. This is our huge event locally during the War of Independence, and very, very significant. Many of the people involved in our revolution, in this wonderful ironic twist that we constantly get in our history, is that most of them got housing in and around Dremne in the 1940s. So when you're looking up the Bureau of Military History for witness statements, if you put Dremne in, you will actually find a considerable number of the people who were involved in our revolution actually were housed in Dremne later on. And these were the people involved in setting up local sports clubs, the credit union. They were heavily involved in their community. Building their country was part of what they did, but also building your local community was a significant part of what they did as well. Now, the Dremne housing, well, the Dremne housing is fascinating. It all goes back to the Housing Act of 1932, and you can see this is going to be interrupted by World War II. And they carry out a considerable amount of social housing. I wonder if we look back our history, will we maybe find solutions to our current problems? Dremne might have been considered one of those solutions. The Dremne farmland to the new houses, they were starting to build on that Dremne farmland right up to the emergency, which is, of course, World War II. We had two distinctive types of social housing built in Dremne. Some were called the parlour houses. They were primarily two-bedroom houses, but had a separate room downstairs. The three-bedroom houses were called the kitchen houses, and they just had a large kitchen with a part of the kitchen would have been the bathroom. So an unusual little quirky thing, but in an effort to try and find ways around ensuring people had good quality housing. Also, the houses, the schools and the church, despite the fact that World War II is going on, although we're not directly involved in it, it's the time we call the emergency, they actually were completed ahead of schedule. The church itself being built by 1943. We started in the 1950s the scheme of tenant purchase. And this worked for the local authority as much as working for the people occupying the houses. Because as the houses age, they're going to need more maintenance. And by the time most of the houses were sold on to the tenants, that is the time when they would need most maintenance of all, thus saving the local authority money. 2/3 of the homes in the Dremne area were actually sold on to the tenants by the 1980s, resulting in Ireland having among the highest home ownership in Western Europe. And that is some journey to take in housing. And Dremne is a big, big part of that when you consider how serious the tenement situation was in Dublin in 1913. By the 1980s, we had actually come full circle. Now, if you remember from the map that I had at the beginning, I was just showing it to you just as an impression of where Dremne was. The original plan for Dremne, believe it or not, was to build it in the shape of this, the Tara brooch. The roads were supposed to work in a circle around a central point, and the image from the air should have been a Tara brooch. It's not quite realized, if we go back to that original map, it's not quite realized, but with a stretch of the imagination, we might be just about able to make out the shape of the Tara brooch there. And what skews it is the rest of Dremne being built, the associated property houses being built at the other end. But from the air, Dremne's intention was to look like a Tara brooch, as opposed to the Crumbling development, which was to look like a Celtic cross or a Celtic pattern from the area. They get it almost right in Crumbling, not quite so in Dremne, but we'll give them their moment in the sun. The intention was good, the intention was there. And what of the houses? Well, that were built, the different houses that we have in Dremne. And I went to Archie Seek just to see what they say about Dremne. And they reckon that they're very modernist in style. They're streamlined with a clean cut line, bold structures with a simple paint scheme, and they have that distinctive band running through the middle of the houses, around the doors and around the windows. They say they're classical, they're elegant, particularly in the treatment of the door cases of the houses in Dremne themselves. And there are these signature semi-detached houses, mainly at corners. You see that particularly around Galtymore, you see it around Mourne as well, and these semi-detached houses mainly at the corner, and the mixture of red brick and of course some of them with the Dolphins barn brick as I showed you earlier on Mourne Road. The one thing about Dremne are those distinctive garden walls and gate piers. We're losing a few of them as people put in driveways and various things, but a lot of them still actually retain them. And there's some of the earlier images, and you can see what they're talking about, the banding on the houses, the door cases, and the gardens. Gardens were important, gave you the opportunity, well ahead of what we're doing now, to grow your own. You had a significant back garden with most of the houses, certainly had front gardens with a lot of them as well. Everyone will remember, of course, the old container, the shop, up at the top of Dremne. Behind that wall, of course, is the Lansdowne Valley. I think there's new houses built along this side of the thing, but that was very much a feature. Shops, were a bit away from you, and you had the local container shop, a feature of Dremne at the time. A couple more images of the houses going back a few years, and the various houses that you get. These are the ones up near Schlieve Bloom, and you get these different treatments around the doors. Again, a mixture of private, associated properties, which I suppose would fall into affordable housing today, and the social housing that were built in Dremne later on. We have a huge housing mix, actually, and don't forget the Rafters Road cottages, the Maori Creek cottages, which I mentioned earlier. The whole estate of Ivy Gardens actually falls into the Dremne area. The private houses around Lissadell, the various apartments that we have in Galtymore and Schlieve Bloom, and a lot more ahead of us by the looks of things. 1,500 associated property houses, a feature of that part of Dremne and also Walkinstown. And then, of course, we have the new houses built on Carrow Road, built in the last few years as such. A huge, huge mix of housing, and with that you get a mixed community of people. The early images are particularly evocative. I love these ones, showing us the early times of the estate, long before we had as many cars in the estate itself, but certainly a lovely feel of a community laid out, houses at angles, so you have a certain amount of privacy as the houses had been constructed. A couple more, a little bit grainier images, but again, anything that I could find just to include today to give us an idea of the different housing in the areas. And of course, the one big feature of Dremne, so handy if you're trying to get the children to learn the mountains of Ireland. Give them a map of Dremne, tell them to go through it, and here's just some of them. Brandon, Curlew, Keeper, Schlieve Bloom, Galtymore, Errigal, Cooley, Carrow, Mourne, I could keep going. They're all there. You can learn your Mountains of Ireland, a naming scheme that was kept throughout the whole estate, with the few exceptions of Brickfield, Ivy, Rafters, Davit, after Michael Davit on Davit Road, and of course we have to include Herberton, and we have to include Crumlin. Hope you've enjoyed that little journey through the history of Dremne, bringing us right back to a tumulus up on the Walkinstown Avenue and making our way right back down to the houses in Dremne and the names that they hold today, the Mountains of Ireland. And a huge, huge thanks to Louise and Kate for all the organisation today. Thank you very much, and we'll take any questions now.
Hi, Cathy. Thanks so much. That was such a fascinating talk. It was really interesting to see Davit Road with one car. If only that was the way it was today. So if anyone has any questions, you can pop them into the Q&A function just at the bottom of the screen. I actually have a quick question, Cathy, if that's okay.
Yeah, Louise.
You mentioned the a source called Archie Seek. What is that? What exactly is that?
Archie Seek is a site used by architects when they're commenting on different types of housing or different types of buildings. And what's nice about our suburbs that we are familiar with today, so suburbs that we might consider new, are actually making it now into Archie Seek and being used as an example for our architects to follow as good models of how housing could be made, could be built, or how future developments could be. And isn't it wonderful to think that what the council, what the corporation were doing in the 1940s is now considered a model of good housing for our architects of today. And that's this is where you realise that you're part of history in what you might consider a modern estate. I think the realisation has hit Ballyfermot, for example, Crumbling and Drimnagh, that they are now part of history as opposed to part of modern developments. And that's when you find them turning up in Archie Seek and places like that, you realise that you're part of history, even though you're living in what you consider a new house, inverted commas, as opposed to a Victorian house in Rathmines, you know. So that's the site that's used.
Look, I think there's a question here from Mary Whelan. So she's asking, was there a village in Dremne in the old days?
No, there wasn't. And I think the reason would be clear when you look at the way the land was used as clay pits for the Dolphins Brick Company. It didn't give the village an opportunity to develop, but you had little hamlets of housing. So you had a small group of housing that grew up around Davit Road. That was connected with the various mills that were located near the present day GAA club, for example. That would have been a mill pond just at that site. There were a few mill houses located there. And you mainly had the development along the Crumbling Road, down in Rialto, and Crumbling Village. Crumbling Village would really have been your village, and so too would Core. So Dremne itself never really had a centre. And the name we associate with Dremne today, that area would have been known as Crumbling North in the past. I'd say on a lot of the original deeds, it's actually marked as Crumbling North. So that's what I mean about a movable Dremne. So where would Dremne's heart have been? I suspect it's more the castle and the old mill. That's really the old heart of Dremne, but no village as such, no.
And we have another question here from Geraldine Canavan, and she wants to know, do you know what the name of the old house on Errigal Road is, where the new hospital research centre is now?
Okay, that was all part of the lands of Leicester House. And we mentioned Leicester House earlier on in the talk, and the old house itself would have been located on Errigal Road. I have a vague memory of the house there. I certainly remember that area being undeveloped. It was unfinished for a lot of my childhood. So that's part of the whole lands of Leicester House. The other large house was Fanshawe House. I'm not sure which one she's referring to. I suspect it's Leicester, where the Crumbling Children's Hospital is, and Fanshawe House then was where Artscolena was on the Crumbling Road. So they're the two large houses at that point along that area.
Perfect. And I have a quick question from Peter, who wants to know where Eleonora was buried, or is it known where she was buried?
Ah, poor Eleonora. Yeah, our love story that makes you cry, you know. I suspect she may have ended up with the famous O'Byrne up in Glenasmole. I think that might be where she is, but maybe she's not, and is that why she's still haunting Dremne Castle? So I'm going to just leave that hanging there and let people draw their own conclusions. I genuinely don't know where Eleanor is buried, but she's supposed to haunt the castle still, and I'm not going to argue with that point. No.
A good story coming up to Halloween.
Yeah, great one.
I have a question from Joan, and she wants to know, is there any land left in Dremne to build houses? I don't know.
Yes, there is, and the land would primarily be along Davit Road, because they were the old industrial units, and I think they are all being rezoned as housing. Now, the type of housing that could go in, I don't know, but they would have been old industrial units, more or less enclosing Dremne. So those sites are large and they're cleared. The other ones would be probably in and around the Brickfield area. I think there's plans for a new development overlooking the park. So again, former industrial units along the Crumbling Road possibly would be rezoned for housing as well. So little pockets, infills, nothing on the scale of what we've got. Nothing on the scale. Yeah.
And a question from Anthony, who wants to know what was found when they demolished the Dremne mound.
Say that last part again. What was found when they demolished?
The Dremne mound.
The Dremne mound, yes.
Yeah.
There's a number of items in the National Museum, but the biggest one that was found was a funeral bowl. So presumably cremated remains were put into this bowl and stored in the mound itself. They're the items the National Museum found out about. Far be it me to suggest that people took items out of the mound when they were removing the clay and the gravel and whatever else they were removing. Quite possibly there were other items there that were lost over the years. But certainly there are items held in our National Museum that are out of the original Dremne mound. So it's up there, Dremne is up there at all the key moments in our history. It's in the National Museum, it's in the Bureau of Military History, it's part of the brickworks, it built the city. It's much more important than just a suburb. It's part of our national story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Sheila Jones wants to know, is Dremne Castle open for visitors?
Like everything else, I think had been closed because of COVID. I heard they opened it for, was a culture night. I think they had it open that weekend for managed tours. So you wouldn't be able to get a huge number of people in, but you could book a tour. I presume the fact that they opened for culture night, I presume they have plans to reopen to the public again as soon as they can. Would be worth inquiring. It's a beautiful visit to make, a fantastic place to go to, and it's only up the road if you're in Dremne. Very walkable, very doable, and very atmospheric. And watch out for Eleanor when you're up there, so she doesn't trip you up,
I have another question. So it's roughly how many houses were built in the area by the council, and were associated properties private houses?
Yeah, the associated property houses were private houses. So today, I suppose we call them affordable. They were built by a co-op. We call it co-op today. Different times, different names. Associated properties were considered really far advanced in addressing the housing problems that we had in the 40s. Dublin's always had a problem with housing its people because our population fluctuates and different needs. And you can't just build houses. You have to build schools, you have to build churches, you have to build shops, all the facilities that people need, hospitals. Dremne got all of those things over the years, but seem to have set a record for doing them fairly quickly. Associated properties built 1,000+ houses. I think it gets mixed up because they're also building on the other side of the Dremne Road at the same time. So some of Walkinstown's figures get included in the Dremne figures. Again, this movable area, you know, different things, but 1,000 plus. And I think it's roughly the same in local authority, which would have increased in more recent years because more houses were built around Carrow Road. And then there's totally private built houses up around Lissadell, Slieve Bloom, around the Lansdowne Valley itself. There's private houses there as well. So if this wonderful mixture, and then the beautiful granite cottages leading up towards the main Crumbling Road, the old, what we used to call the Land League cottages, but they're more recent and built again when it was farmers' labourers that we were actually housing in the area. So you've this wonderful mix of housing, well worth having a wander around and just take in the area. There's so much more to see than you'd realise.
Absolutely. I'm going to be studying bricks now when I make walk again. Jean would like to know, what year did the Eleanora event take place?
Okay, I haven't got a year because for a historian, I'm dreadful for dates and I hang my head in shame when I say that. But it's certainly back in our medieval times. So I'm guessing, and this is a total guess on Cathy's part, but certainly it's somewhere in the 12 to the 1400s, somewhere there. And I think the best thing to say to that one is, I suggest you Google Lady Eleanora and see what comes up. But it's an old, is it legend? Is it fact? Is it a story? I don't know. But you tell me why they named a pub the Eleanora, and we have this story of the Lady Eleanora in Dremne Castle. So like all of these stories, there's legend, there's myth, and there's fact, and it's all mixed in there. I couldn't tell the story of Dremne without bringing Lady Eleanora into it.
Yeah, perfect. Anne would like to know, were people relocated from Inchicore to Dremne by DCC?
Yeah, people came from all over to live in Dremne. You get a lot of people in Dremne that would claim their roots back in around the Liberties, in and around the South City area. I know some of my own family would have come from around the South City area, so who are living out in Dremne. Some people moved up from Inchicore, but Inchicore had its own community. So if you were living in the houses near the works, you most likely were working in the works. So why would you move further out? Dremne wouldn't have given you much bigger houses, would have given you some bigger houses, depending on housing conditions. But certainly a lot of people from the Liberties area moved out. What is wonderful to look at are those, the Bureau of Military History witness statements. I mentioned that in the talk. If you Google Dremne, a lot of the statements come up and you can work out from there where people were living, because they will refer in the statement to where they were, maybe the Liberties, somewhere around Thomas Street area, and yet they have a Dremne address, so you can kind of work it out that way. Again, the pension files are very useful for that too. You can see how people moved at different times. So anyone locating out of the city in and around the 1940s would have been in Dremne. A little bit earlier would have been in Crumlin. And the lovely thing about Dremne was it became a very settled area very quickly, because people moved in and made it their community. They immediately turned it into a community. So you didn't get a huge transient population. Once people moved there, they stayed there because they had everything they needed. You had your school, you had your church, you were near shops, you were near Crumlin, you weren't too far from the city. So it became a settled community quickly.
Okay, just a couple more questions. So Eileen wants to know, was Dremne, Bluebell, etc. once part of the Catholic parish of Clondalkin?
Yes, that's a great question, and she's right. It was once part of Clondalkin. In fact, the old Dremne parish church, the ruin that I showed on the slides, that falls quickly into the control of Clondalkin. The church in Dremne, Our Lady of Good Counsel, was actually built by the parish of Dolphins Barn. It's one of Dolphins Barn's daughters. Dolphins Barn has 3 daughters. It built St. Bernadette's in Clogher Road. Our Lady of Good Counsel in Drimnagh, and Fatima in Rialto. So those three are daughters of Dolphins Barn. Dolphins Barn itself is a daughter of James Street Parish. So if you were doing a family tree for the churches, that's the way it would fall. But so Dolphins Barn would have been the parish to set Drimnagh up originally in the 40s. So that's the way it worked. And now I suppose Drimnagh would slightly lean towards Crumlin in its relationships, the way the diocese is divided out. Things change, times change, and things are redrawn. So yes, it certainly had a connection to Clondalkin at one time, and in more recent times then it has connection to Dolphins Barn, and in the present time I would suggest that it has a very close association with St. Agnes's in Crumlin.
It really is a moving.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, times change, needs to change, and things are redrawn and looked at again.
Absolutely. One question from Alan, and he wants to know, why was there only one public house built in Dremne?
That's a brilliant question. I don't know. I just presume that the tradition of the public houses was that people would go to the pub after work. So the pub was near where you worked. So you had, for example, the pubs in Inchicore would have been for anybody who was in the works, working in the CIE works there. The Marble Arch, I think, is the pub he's referring to, which would be the one on David Road. On the other side, you had the one, the Halfway House, which would have been the older pub. The Eleonora, we can claim it. It's the name is part of the Drimnagh story. Yeah, so it's a good question, but I genuinely don't know. Maybe our priority was more to build schools, churches, and a children's hospital. That's what Drimnagh claim. They're the key items. The unusual thing about the schools is they are considered today to be absolutely perfect for COVID times, because they've got very large windows, excellent ventilation, and they have a rock solid concrete roof built because they were built during the Second World War, and the fear would be air raids. So they were built to protect our children. So the school buildings that we have in Drimnagh would be considered a model for managing COVID, because you have cross ventilation in the school building. You have excellent windows, you have large windows, and very, very good ventilation through the building. So there's a lot to be proud of about Drimnagh. And maybe, you know, we learn a lot by looking back sometimes to find present day problems and solve them, you know.
Absolutely. Quick question from Geraldine. She's interested in the associated properties, and she just wants to know if there's any places that she can go to research and find out more about them.
Okay, so it's a great question. And again, it brings us back to the one we had a little bit earlier when you mentioned Archieseek. It's only relatively recently that you see references to Drimnagh, Ballyfermot, Crumlin, you know, those old estates. You start seeing reference to them in the old, in the archives, because the information is becoming available. As a general rule in this country, we don't publish items on 100 years have passed. It's almost like GDPR, if you like, you know, that control of information. So it can be a bit of a struggle when you're trying to look at something from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. You don't find that information readily available. The places I would start, and I always do, is the Friendly Archive, which is the Dublin City Library and Archive in Pearse Street, because it's so easy to look at things for our city there, because it is the city archive. And that would be where I start. But I would also look at the Institute of Architects, which is located on Merrion Square, which I think the Archieseek site is associated with. They probably have information only if the builder submitted it to them for archival purposes. So you're still on a little bit of a cusp with places like Drimnagh. It's not quite history yet, but it nearly is. So the next few years, more and more of those things should come out. Don't ignore the witness statements either, although they're about a time of the Irish Revolution. They tell you a lot about the people who lived in the area. So yeah, so that they'd be the places I'd go to.
Yeah, it's always good to get the first-hand accounts with the witness statements.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, just 2 more questions for you.
Great, no problem.
So, Third House on Davit Road was used for refugees during the 1970s. And also, Sandlands beside the Marble Arch, was it a farm in living memory?
Can't really comment on the refugee one. I genuinely don't know. Possibly, yes. There's various small farms in that part of Dremne. A lot of the land would have been sublet by the Brick Company as small farm holdings. I haven't come across the name Scanlon, but I stand to be completely corrected on that one. Most of Dremne was owned by the Brick Company, so you didn't get that many. You just had wide open fields. You didn't have that many houses in it or individual farms, and the exception would have been along Davit Road because that was connected to the canal and the mills. So that's where you have the slight anomaly in the whole story. But again, you know, I bow to other people's knowledge of these things because I couldn't comment on it.
And just a question from Margaret. Was Ivy Gardens built with Dolphins farm brick, or were Dolphins farm bricks always yellow? So.
Okay, no, Ivy Marks is a little bit, or Ivy Gardens, I beg your pardon, is a little bit later. Again, they're a Guinness development, so they're built for the Guinness workers. I don't think they're Dolphins farm brick. I've never heard that. Guinness went more down the road of an English style development, and in a lot of cases would have taken their materials from Britain. So I'm not sure. I don't think they are Dolphins barn. I'd love to think they were, but again, I'd have to check that one up. I haven't really dug into the story of Ivy Gardens in all that detail. And that'll probably land on my plate sometime in the future. But I don't think they are. I don't think they are Dolphins barn.
Perfect. Okay, I think that is it for the questions. Just to mention, we have Dave zooming in from Sydney. So, hello, Dave.
James.
So I'm going to finish up, and I'd like to thank Cathy for her amazing talk. It was so fascinating. As I said,